I'm Ashley Hawkins, and I am the manga librarian. And today we are talking about horror, specifically horror manga. And yeah, let's get into it. So, we're talking about horror manga in a collection development context because it is different from other manga. One thing to note is that it is kind of entrenched in the various categories of manga. There is shonen horror manga, there's shoujo horror manga, there's josei horror manga, blah blah blah. Because as I've said, those are categories of demographics, and this is a genre. So, it's not quite as linear to talk about as the past couple of genre deep dives have been, because the history is a little bit more messy. But when I talk about horror manga, I am really talking specifically about manga that has, that is firmly in the horror genre, not just manga that has maybe some horror elements, because there are, like, vampires might show up in a shonen manga, maybe a shonen battle manga or an action adventure type series, but it might not be horror. So I wanna firmly put us in that horror category. So I'm really talking about paranormal or psychological thrillers that are meant to give the effective impact of, being in a horrified state, that are meant to provoke the feelings of horror. So we want to firmly put ourselves there, just to kind of keep this from being too unwieldy. Is important, because there's, I read a manga recently that had vampires in it, but I wouldn't call it horror. It's more of a comedy with horror elements, maybe. So we want to, let's keep it firmly in. But it can get blurry. So let's, some things to keep in mind also are that in various cultures, the things that, when we talk about things that horrify us or scare us, there are things that may be culturally different. And the same is true of Japan. There are things that unify us, and there are things that are uniformly horrifying, but then there are particular anxieties that may be unique to a culture or may be more prevalent in a particular culture. So so when I was, an academic, I wrote a paper on Japanese horror and the importance of honoring the dead and performing certain death rituals, and how the failure to perform those death rituals can create situations in horror. So I focused on two popular and famous Japanese horror films, Ugetsu and Ringu, in order to highlight these particular anxieties and how they are a cultural anxiety that is specific to Japan. We in the West may not, we might have some of that anxiety, but it's not to the same level as it is in Japan, just because of certain traditions and historical contexts. So these are things to keep in mind. And there is an entire folklore and history and tradition that is associated with Shintoism and the yokai and the kami of Japan that is unique to Japan. There are also, a lot of things that have happened to the Japanese people and that the Japanese people have perpetuated. Or not the Japanese people, but Japan as a nation has perpetuated, I guess I should say, that create other anxieties and also maybe some national forms of guilt that need to be dealt with. And I think that's something we as Westerners can probably understand, because we have things that we as a culture feel guilt about and try to deal with in our horror, and to good or bad effect, and things that have happened. So there's certain anxieties and things that are going to pop up. Clearly, nuclear disasters are something that happen quite a bit in Japanese horror. You'll also see a lot of natural disasters. There will be a lot of total devastation, and bodily mutilation, and just very different ideas about death and the body and all sorts of things. So, that's just, let's keep those sort of things in mind. But yeah, so let's give a little bit of historical context, and then I'm going to talk more about some titles you probably should know, and then talk even more about considerations and my specific advice for if you are collecting horror manga. So let's get into this. So first off, we can't talk about horror manga without talking about gekiga. So gekiga is more of, so the best way to put gekiga is, how when the term graphic novels first started popping up, and it was really a way for people to try and distance themselves from the term comic books. Gekiga is a very similar term in Japanese. It's supposed to be, it means dramatic pictures. And so it's a way of kind of distancing from manga. So it's meant to have a more cinematic style. It's supposed to be for more mature audiences. It's supposed to be a higher art style. These are more art books. I have some gekiga, Cats of the Louvre, by Taya Matsumoto, is Cats of the Louvre by Taiyo Matsumoto is a Gekiga, and it's one of my favorites. I really love that particular manga. It looks very different from traditional manga, and so it's something that's very artistic, and there is a relationship with horror manga. Horror manga in general tends to look different from traditional manga, although there is horror manga that, you know, has a very traditional look. There's no hard and fast rules here, but you tend to see more artistic things being put out in horror manga. So we can't talk about horror manga without talking about Junji Ito, but I don't want to make this just the Junji Ito show. I am a huge fan of Junji Ito. I'm also a huge fan of his wife, who illustrated the cats. Like, I'm wearing something that has his wife's illustration, so this is Ayoko Ishiguro, who is Junji Ito's wife, and she does these illustrations of yokai cats, bakaneko. And so I'm going to say, you can't really talk about it without talking about him. And if you've seen Junji Ito's work, it is very different from, say, Naruto. It doesn't look like shonen manga. It looks a little bit more realistic. It looks a little bit more in line with what we associate with graphic novels here in the West. It's almost like this intermediary. And there are people who are fans of only horror manga, such as Junji Ito's work, and won't read any other manga. And these are things to be aware of. So anyway, the relationship between the two is that both started appearing in the kashihonya, or the lending libraries or rental libraries, from the 1950s and 60s in Japan. So I say libraries, but they're not like the libraries you and I work at, because they charged people. So it's hence the word renting library. It's more like a video store, but for books and magazines. And the thing is, like, think of it as a way of like distributing things like zines or small print magazines that you couldn't print very many of, but you wanted a lot of people to read and have access to. So you would put them into these lending libraries that people would pay to read and then return, and then you would be able to, you know, distribute it more widely, but still kind of get a return on it, which actually enabled the expansion of both Gekiga and horror, because both were kind of less mainstream, harder to sell to, you know, these magazines of like shonen and shoujo manga, where things were very formulaic and very, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, very, you know, very clean and, you know, really targeted at children. And these were things that were more targeted towards adults. So you really needed to find your audience first and then establish that we have an audience for this. So what really kicked it into the mainstream was the work of an artist named Shigeru Mizuki. Shigeru Mizuki is a very, very important artist in terms of manga, just in general. He is actually a really incredible figure. He was a World War II veteran, obviously on the Japanese side, who lost his dominant arm while fighting in the war, and came back and learned how to draw with his non-dominant arm, and actually committed his life to creating manga. And through his manga, he focused on preserving the stories of yokai. So yokai are these spirits. The translation can be like spirits or demons, that are in Japanese folklore. So he was preserving Japanese folklore by putting it into his manga, which was called Gegege no Kitaro. It's also just known as Kitaro. And it's an incredibly popular manga in Japan. It definitely has its followers here in the States. People do know how important Shigeru Mizuki is. He won many awards. He actually lived a pretty long life. He lived until 2015, and was recognized for his contributions to the medium. And he did this incredible work of preserving these stories and repopularizing them, because a lot of these stories were oral in tradition, and there were obviously really terrible things that happened in the world during World War II, and there was a sincere risk of losing this oral tradition. So by placing these stories into Gegege no Kitaro, he was able to preserve them. And now yokai are a very important part of manga and anime, and they're something that we know quite a bit about. If you're interested in reading things about yokai and such, and if you read Kitaro, Zack Davisson has written some really great books on the topic, and also he is the translator for Gegege no Kitaro. He translated the Kitaro books for Drawn and Quarterly. You can also follow him on Twitter. He's a really great resource, and he's also a really great translator. So I've consulted with his work for this a bit. I find his stuff really useful. He's been doing the work for a long time. I have one of his books right here, Kaibyo, The Supernatural Cats of Japan. This is such a great book that my husband got for me, talking about, cat yokai. So these are topics that, and we owe a lot to, or a lot is owed to Shigeru Mizuki for doing his work. But also, the manga itself is incredibly popular. The characters are popular. It's been turned into anime, live action television shows, video games, everything. It's incredibly popular. It has horror. It obviously has horror elements. It's about a young boy, Kitaro, who is, a ghoul, and he is okay. It's on a young boy named Kitaro, who is the last survivor of the Ghost Tribe, and it's all of his different adventures with different yokai and creatures from Japanese mythology. And he actually travels around with the remains of his father, which is in an eyeball that he carries around with him. And he also has these other sort of sidekicks, and it's really interesting. It's really addictive. The art style is really unique. It holds up, and it has a richness to it, and a really highly illustrative quality. And it kind of has that perfect border between kawaii and horror. And really, it's more of a dark fantasy. It's not as horrifying as like what you'll see in Junji Ito, but it's a very important work. I highly recommend getting some of the Kitaro titles. You may not have them, which you really should. Once people actually are exposed to it, they really love it. It holds up really well. It's from the 60s, but like I said, the illustrative qualities are just really amazing. It's just very well done. You learn a lot too about yokai and Japanese culture, and I don't know. I really like Kitaro. So, and it's a little bit more geared towards a younger audience, so it's actually a good one to kind of collect and have those horror elements. It's kind of, it has this quirky coolness to it. So he was kind of the big heavy hitter. There was also Kazuyo Umezu, who wrote Drifting Classroom, which is actually my husband's favorite manga. Well, besides Akira. And Drifting Classroom is something that I would say is a classic, but also read it before you add it to your library collection. It involves students being trapped in their school in a particularly horrifying situation, and nobody's really a good person in it. Kids act like kids, and for better or for worse. It's particularly gory, and there's quite a bit of psychological horror, and the adults are particularly heinous in this story. So just be aware of it. It's going to depend on your population. Yeah, just be mindful. I find a lot of value in it. I think that it has kind of an akin to like Hunger Games, and I think you can draw a line from it to Battle Royale. And I think there's a lot of literary quality to it. You know, just like I said, before you purchase, read it, and make a decision about whether or not it's best for your school, for your audience, just because of the gore levels and the psychological intensity. So in the early days, it was often you often saw things published in shonen magazines with these like sympathetic protagonists that kind of had like a scary element to them. So like Kitaro, who is actually like kind of a nice kid, but you know, he carries his dad's eyeball around with him. And they're just kind of leading through these tales about ghosts and demons. It's a very episodic genre, so you often have like this. So you have this character like Kitaro that is leading you through the larger, sort of a pantheon of stories, sort of a Are You Afraid of the Dark? It's a very anthology sort of system, and that has to do with, particularly in horror manga, the short form is king. So short stories reign supreme. That is very rare in manga, as you are probably aware. Usually manga runs for like many volumes, especially shonen. But horror manga tends to be maybe one chapter. Junji Ito publishes his anthologies fairly regularly, and sometimes they'll carry on for. So his most recent collection, Love Sickness, which I personally will buy from my library. My recommendation with horror is that you read it. Oftentimes I'll say, like, you can read reviews, you can, sort of sample, and that'll give you a good idea when it comes to manga. But when it comes to horror, there are so many elements that are going to be very subjective to your school community. And I'm really talking to school librarians in this. For public librarians, I think going by reviews and such is completely fine. But for school librarians, you need to read it, particularly because they come in these anthology collections. So the thing is, like, Love Sickness, the first story is, I think it's like 4 or 5 chapters, and that's the story that the anthology is titled after. And so it went on for a few chapters, and then there are other stories that are like 1 chapter, maybe. I think there was a couple that were like, there was one that was like 2 chapters, and then there was a slightly episodic one that involved some repeating characters. And those stories can range very widely, and oftentimes the publisher will focus on that main story as like the linchpin, because that's the main draw to get you to buy the collection, is that main story. So Love Sickness is the big draw to buy Love Sickness. And you may not know what the other stories inside of the anthology are. And even a reviewer might not go through individually each and every story inside of a Junji Ito anthology, because Junji Ito anthologies are about 500 pages, and there can be, gosh, how many stories were in Love Sickness? There were so many. There were several stories, and like, I can't even remember how many there were. So when it's like that, even when you're writing the review, you might forget. You could pass over something, and your patrons, your students, and there are things that are traumatic to particular communities, or that particular communities can't handle, that about, and especially when it comes to horror-based things. So, there's certain sensitivities that you want to be aware of, and that you know about, and maybe you don't want images of in your collection, just because it could be potentially traumatic for your students. Remember that the public library is always there, is what I say. Because we're selecting for, our audience. So yeah, I'm always like, this is the one that I really love. I love horror manga, but I also say you've got to read it, and you've got to read it from front to back. You can't get around it if you are a school librarian. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after I've finished going through context. The reason why, actually, is that horror manga also has a relationship to subcultures. There are stories that were published for alternative magazines. And there is some eroguro. So eroguro literally means erotic gore. And so you need to be aware of those things. That's not what... So Junji Ito does not write that. I am not going to recommend any eroguro. That is not what I'm into. That's just not my thing. It is some people's thing, and in terms of manga, it's just not my thing. But I do want you to be aware that, you've got to know the relationships here of these subgenres, and how, things get muddy. I will say it was more popular in the 70s, although there is still, there's always interest. But it wasn't really until the 80s that horror started to become mainstream. Actually, it's after the 80s, the 90s. Because in the 80s, there were no horror magazines. I'm sorry, I'm reading my notes wrong. So in the 80s, there were no horror magazines. So there was no Shonen Jump for horror. But in 1996, Halloween magazine was debuted. And it primarily had to do with more of the horror titles doing better in mainstream magazines like Ribbon. So there were shoujo titles that were doing really well in the mainstream. So, for example, I am a huge fan of Moto Hagio. I think I've mentioned this before. And I have in front of me the Pooh Clan, which is a very beautiful shoujo horror manga. We were seeing more and more of this in sort of that time period. This is so good. So this was actually released in the 70s. And I mean, you can tell kind of from the artwork. Such a gorgeous, gorgeous series. But the point being that there was just this slow trickle as horror was becoming more and more prevalent, that finally there were magazines put out. And we started to see titles like Pet Shop of Horrors, Vampire Princess Miyu, a little bit more mainstream horror titles, and we saw Junji Ito make his breakout with Tomy. He contributed to Halloween magazine in 1987. So, did I say 1996 earlier? Halloween came out in 1986, not 96. So Tomy came out in 1987, 1 year into Halloween's existence. It's also important to note that Halloween is technically a shoujo magazine. So Junji Ito is a shoujo mangaka. Just saying. So yeah, Tomy was really Junji Ito's big breakout, and it led to him writing many more books. And the thing is, all of these works really hold up. Most of them have been turned into movies. One thing to kind of note is that horror manga tends not to get made into anime. Some of it does, like Vampire Princess Miyu is an anime, but they often get made into horror films. And that kind of has to do with the fact that it tends to be in that short format, in that short story format. So that's really easy to turn into an anthology film. Horror anthologies are also really popular in Asia in general. So there's this tradition of like putting out a collection of films that are directed by maybe a few different directors, and they're all kind of giving their own horror, like short horror film. There's kind of a tightness to horror in Japan and Korea that really works. There's a reason why certain films work better in their Japanese iteration than they do in their American iteration, and it's because of that tightness. There's a nice compactness, which actually a lot of Japanese film doesn't necessarily have. Japanese film tends to be a bit bloated at times. They tend to go on a little long and feel a little drawn out. They tend to let scenes breathe a little too much. But in horror, there is like such perfect compactness. If you're interested in horror cinema from Japan, I can recommend quite a bit. Ringu and Ugetsu are obvious ones. Hausu is also an absolute favorite of mine. There's so much. And the cinema informs the manga informs the cinema. There's so much relationship between the visual mediums there's just, the visualization is just so wonderful. There are scenes in Ringu that I really, really love. I love the scene when Sadako is found in the well, and the main character just so lovingly pulls her out of the well. I just find it so satisfying. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about, because I'm going on for quite some time. Let's talk a little bit about what you need to consider and things you need to be aware of. So, things you need to be aware of are that Japanese horror can have things in it that can really push the boundaries for a Western audience. Suicide is very prevalent honestly, in manga in general. Suicide is a fairly frequent topic and is spoken about with regularity. I will say that suicide rates are not as high as they once were in Japan. It's the suicide issue is more complicated, and the mental health issue in Japan is more complicated than just surfacely saying that Japan has a mental health issue. They certainly do, but I think so does the United States. So does every nation. It's a little bit more complicated. That doesn't mean they don't have a problem. That doesn't mean that it should be ignored. And there's definitely suicide is looked at differently. There's a different relationship with suicide than there is in the West. And there's a lot of suicide that happens on school grounds that is seen by students inside of these works. A very popular trope is for a student to jump off of the roof of their school building. That is so common that it's crazy. But it's just a thing. Jumping is a fairly common suicide method in Japan, so take that what you will. It can be honestly pretty explicit in terms of methodologies of suicide and things of that nature. So those are things to be aware of, particularly when you're working with young people. So sometimes there are points where you do get the sense that maybe this title is better off in an adult collection, maybe it's better in a public library collection than in your school library collection, because you just want to be sort of responsible. So just be aware that suicide is a pretty familiar topic. Bodily mutilation happens very frequently. Mutation, you see this very, very, usually it's through scientific experimentation, which comes from post-war anxieties. and a lot of anxieties about, you know, the post-atomic bomb droppings. Just, you know, recognize that there were certain anxieties that were being dealt with and are still being dealt with in terms of harms upon Japanese bodies that were perpetuated by our nation, and that are still being kind of dealt with. And they also have had other nuclear issues with the Fukushima disaster. So, you know, cancer rates are high in Japan. There's a lot of stuff about decaying bodies and bodily collapse. So these are things to be aware of. Sickness is pretty prevalent. Then, of course, we have to also talk about the sexual assault, because it's in there too. And both of people of all genders, and for various purposes. So So these are all things that we have to be mindful of, because they might have certain impacts on our students, depending on our populations, depending on what they've been through. They may not belong in a school library. And doesn't mean they don't have literary worth, doesn't mean they don't belong in a public library. Even somebody who's a hardcore horror fan like me knows that there are limits, and that there are things that belong in certain collections. So, you know, those are things to be mindful of. So, that being said, not all of it is like that. It's not all blood and, well, maybe it's all blood, but there's also a lot of psychological elements, a lot of things that are being kind of coped with. When I was an academic, I did a lot of work with affect theory, and I personally find that horror has the potential to help us work through anxieties. And so that's why it's also important to make things available within a developmentally appropriate context. So, like I said, I'm going to get Love Sickness. I found all the stories developmentally appropriate for my students. Horrifying things happen in it, but I found that it was all perfectly fine. I've talked about how there is a Junji Ito book that I won't get for my library. I have Uzumaki. I have Tomi. I do have Drifting Classroom. I found it perfectly fine for my population. Other horror manga that I have Kitaro. I also have, so Tokyo Ghoul is also a horror manga. That one's really popular, really accessible. I highly recommend it. It's a favorite of the librarian who runs the CCD collection in New York City, Jillian Ehlers. She really loves it. It's a good horror manga. There's I really recommend at least looking at Akira. It's a classic. It's the manga goes much more in depth than the film. I really like it. Like I said, it's my husband's favorite. Horror manga is something that my husband and I share an interest in. So it's, you know, there are things that are, you know, that are in my library collection and can find a place in yours. Like I said, Kitaro is a good one to get. That's probably one I can pretty easily recommend because it was written for a younger audience and therefore is pretty tame. It's more ghost stories than it is gore stories. And in general, ghosts are always going to be safer than gore. So yeah, I have talked so much in this video, and I hope this was useful to you. I will see you in the next one. I am going to start moving away from these genre deep dives and into different topics of discussion after this point. I know what my next topic is going to be, but you'll find out what it is when I post it. So that's really all for right now. I will see you in the next one.